Abraham Lincoln's accomplishments as 16th President of the United States were born of a national crisis that threatened to destroy the foundations of constitutional democracy in the United States. The leadership that he displayed in navigating the uncharted waters of emancipation and civil war has won him the esteem of Americans as their finest president. Indeed, the historical profession has consistently lauded the statesmanship of Lincoln, whose uncompromising defense of the Union served the greater purpose of achieving equality. He was born in a Kentucky dirt-floored log cabin to a poor backwoods farmer, Thomas, and his wife, Nancy. Frontier homesteads in Kentucky and Indiana were playgrounds for Abraham and his older sister, Sarah. At the age of 9, Lincoln's mother died. Within a year, his father remarried and merged his new wife and her 3 children into the small one-room cabin. Abe found Sarah Bush Lincoln to be a warm and caring stepmother. The opportunity for education was virtually non-existent. In all his life, he claimed that his total schooling amounted to less than a year. But he was an unusually ambitious fellow who pursued self-education through borrowed books and newspapers. By the age of 16, Abe was 6 feet tall, a gangly but strong young man with a reputation as a strong axeman and wrestler. He also was developing skilled storytelling and the powerful use of humor. As one friend wrote, he was witty, sad, and reflective by turns. By early 1830, the Lincoln family moved to Illinois, but the 21-year-old Abe was anxious to be on his own and took a steady job at a new general store in New Salem, Illinois. He described himself as a friendless, uneducated, penniless boy when he arrived in New Salem. With his gift for swapping stories and making friends, Lincoln easily fit into New Salem. He joined the New Salem Debating Society, which met weekly at a local tavern. While he enjoyed the process of debating, he was self-conscious about his meager education. He ambitiously worked to improve himself, spending long hours reading as he minded the store. When the general store closed in 1832, Abraham's friends urged him to run for the Illinois state legislature. Lacking any other plan, he did and lost. For the next couple of years, he held a variety of jobs as a farmhand, rail splitter, surveyor, and a postmaster. In 1834, he ran for and was elected an Illinois state legislator. Meanwhile, he began studying to be a lawyer, and after 3 years of self-instruction, he passed the law exam. At the age of 28, he arrived in Springfield, Illinois, the new capital of Illinois, with $7 in his pocket. He rapidly became a sought-after lawyer and was re-elected to the state legislature as a member of the Whig Party, whose program to promote economic opportunity was easy for him to identify with. During this period, the socially awkward Abe became smitten with Mary Todd, the pampered and temperamental daughter of a wealthy family. She admired his ambition and made a shy Abraham feel comfortable. Finally, after a bumpy relationship, Abraham and Mary were wed in a secret ceremony in 1842. His career as a junior law partner flourished, and his family grew to include 4 sons. In 1844, he set up his own law practice with William H. Herndon as partner. He retired from the Illinois State Legislature after 4 terms to serve 1 term in the United States Congress from 1847 to 1849. When he entered Congress, 2 major issues were of national concern: the war between the United States and Mexico, which had recently broken out, and the spread of slavery beyond the South. Slavery had never prospered in the North and had even been outlawed, but for the most part, the North was willing to leave slavery in the South alone. Early in his career, Lincoln made few public statements about the slavery issue. As a young state legislator, he did take a stand, stating that slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy. 10 years later, as a U.S. congressman, he voted with his party to stop the spread of slavery and introduced a bill to outlaw slavery in the nation's capital, but he did not become an anti-slavery crusader. By the end of his congressional term in 1849, the slavery issue had become entangled with every public question of the day. Lincoln now chose to concentrate on his law practice and stayed out of politics for the next 5 years. Lincoln traveled the Illinois circuit, arguing cases in country courthouses. Meanwhile, vast new territories were opening up in the West, bringing the North and South into conflict. Each section wanted to control the Western territories. The South needed new lands for the large-scale cultivation of cotton and other crops with slave labor. The North, on the other hand, demanded the Western lands be reserved for the free labor of independent farmers and workers. As each territory reached statehood and gained congressional voting, the crucial question was, would that state enter the Union as a free state or a slave state? The issue came to a head in 1854 when Congress passed the bitterly debated Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had been introduced by Lincoln's old political rival, Stephen Douglas, now a U.S. Senator from Illinois. Douglas's policy of popular sovereignty caused a storm of protest in the North. By opening the new territories to slavery, his measure overturned the long-standing Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had held slavery in check. With the passage of Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln could no longer remain silent. For the first time in 5 years, he neglected his law practice. He wanted to hold public office again so that he might influence policy. In 1855, he made an unsuccessful bid for Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas's Senate seat. Soon afterwards, he switched from the splintered Whig Party to join a new party, the Republicans, who wanted to contain the spread of slavery. In 1858, he once again ran against Stephen Douglas. On the night that he was nominated in June 1858, Lincoln gave his famous House Divided speech.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other.
Though he would once again lose the race, this speech and the series of debates with Douglas catapulted Lincoln into national prominence. By 1860, he was mentioned as a possible candidate for president. At first, he doubted that he could win, but with the urging of powerful Republican leaders, Lincoln acquiesced and ran for president against a badly split Democratic Party. His public image as Honest Abe and the rail splitter had great appeal. His speeches and debates proved that he was highly intelligent and movingly eloquent. He was elected president by a minority of the popular vote. For the South, his election was cause to secede from the Union. In December, 3 months before he took his oath of office, South Carolina led the way by announcing that it was now a sovereign nation dedicated to the preservation of slavery. By Inauguration Day on March 4, 1861, 7 states had seceded and 4 more were about to join them. It was announced that Jefferson Davis was the President of the Confederate States. Rumors of assassination plots and plans of Southerners to seize the Capitol put the Army on alert as President-elect Lincoln proceeded to Washington, D.C. for swearing in. 30,000 people stood on the East Plaza before the Capitol and listened to his speech in deep silence. He appealed to the people of the South, assuring them again that he would not tamper with slavery in their states. Lincoln wanted to believe that the Union could be saved without bloodshed, but the new president declared that he intended to defend and maintain the Union and to enforce federal laws in all states, just as the Constitution directed him to do. On March 5, 1861, the day after his inauguration, rebel troops surrounded Fort Sumter, located at the entrance to the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Hostilities seemed inevitable. Just 5 weeks after Lincoln took office, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter, beginning the Civil War. Lincoln declared it an insurrection and asked for a militia of 75,000 volunteers for 3 months to put it down. Congress did not convene until July 4th. Without their involvement, he established a blockade, suspended the writ of habeas corpus for disloyal activity, spent money without congressional approval, and controlled the war effort. Lincoln's broad interpretation of presidential power during the war did not go without question. When Congress convened, he yielded on most legislative matters, but he carefully preserved his independence on questions that he considered executive responsibility. Meanwhile, everyone believed that the war would end quickly. The North claimed the loyalty of 23 states with a population of 22 million. The 11 states of the Confederacy had about 9 million people, and nearly 4 million of them were slaves. The South was mainly agricultural, while the North had factories to produce ammunition and guns, a network of railroads to transport troops, and a powerful navy that could blockade southern ports. But the South's military advantage was in its leadership. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was a professional soldier. In addition, Southerners made up a high proportion of the country's skilled military commanders, such as General Robert E. Lee and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Indeed, Lincoln's biggest headache during the early years of the war would be to find competent generals who could lead the Union to victory. By the summer of 1861, both sides were training large armies of volunteers, many of them inexperienced boys who could barely handle a rifle. In July, Union forces under General Irwin McDowell marched into Virginia. Their objective was to sweep down to Richmond and quell the rebellion, but all did not go well. The disaster at Bull Run, the first major battle of the war in July, would be only one of a series of defeats that the Union suffered on the Virginia front. Meanwhile, the Union launched 2 additional offensives, one into Tennessee, the other down the Mississippi River. Lincoln gave command of the Eastern armies to General George B. McClellan, a 35-year-old veteran of the Mexican War. McClellan was considered vain and pompous. Nevertheless, Lincoln had faith in him. McClellan trained his growing army with meticulous care, but as the months passed, he showed no signs of moving against the rebel forces massed in Virginia. On the Western Front, it was the same story. Union commanders built up their forces and drilled their men, but they weren't ready to fight. With no military expertise and generals who appeared reluctant to move into action, Lincoln delved into the study of military strategy, often reading late into the night. Soon, he assumed an active role in the day-to-day conduct of the war and displayed a shrewd grasp of strategic planning. In February of 1862, the North had initiated a broad offensive in the West, finally winning its first victories of the war. By spring, Northern troops had captured New Orleans and were gaining control of the crucial Mississippi River. While the news was encouraging, the cost in human lives was horrifying. During a single 2-day battle at Shiloh in southern Tennessee, 13,000 Union soldiers had been killed or wounded. Northern morale sank as the Union forces failed to win battles. Lincoln was criticized for not firing McClellan and for refusing to proclaim emancipation. In his typical style, Lincoln responded cautiously. He steadfastly held that the aim of the war was the preservation of the Union, but he was increasingly convinced that undermining slavery would be necessary to weaken the Confederacy. In September 1862, the Union Army defeated Robert E. Lee's Confederate troops at Antietam, and Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation. He gave the rebelling states until January 1, 1863, to cease fighting. After that deadline, he would declare their slaves free. When January 1st arrived, he issued a final proclamation of emancipation, mandating that Union armed forces were now to liberate the slaves in the rebelling states as an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. The legal impact of the proclamation was uncertain, but it redefined the nature of the war and was of great symbolic significance. In addition, the proclamation liberated Lincoln from the barrier that had separated his private thoughts from his public statesmanship. Not everyone rejoiced with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Thousands of Northern Democrats were infuriated. They had supported the war to save the Union. Slavery, as it was to remain intact and confined to the South. They accused the president of being a tyrant, an abolitionist dictator. When critics demanded that he change his policy, he replied,
"I am a slow walker, but I never walk backward."
But the emancipation was proving successful. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers had joined the Northern Army, most of them freed slaves. Yet victory was nowhere in sight. For months, the fighting had continued with a mounting death toll. Lincoln was still having bad luck with his generals. In June 1863, a determined General Lee marched his Confederate troops into the North. From Virginia, across Maryland, and into Pennsylvania, throwing the North into a panic. Lincoln's newest commander was General George Gordon Meade, who rushed his troops to Pennsylvania to stop the rebels. The two armies met on July 1st at the country town of Gettysburg, where 170,000 troops clashed in the most spectacular battle of the war. On July 4th, after 3 days of fierce fighting, with more than 50,000 casualties on both sides, Lee's broken and defeated army headed back for Virginia. To the president's dismay, Meade did not pursue the weakened Southern Army. 4 months later, a ceremony was held at Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery to the soldiers who had died there. The principal address was given by Edward Everett, a popular orator who spoke for 2 hours. Then Lincoln, who had been invited to say a few words, stood up to address the crowd.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
His entire Gettysburg Address was a brief 2 minutes long and has become regarded as one of the finest examples of writing in the English language. On the Western Front, Union armies had been winning a string of victories. On July 4th, 1863, the day after the battle at Gettysburg, the fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. As Lincoln was delivering his Gettysburg Address, Grant's armies were fighting their way through Tennessee and heading for Georgia, the heart of the Confederacy. Grant had emerged as the one commander that the president could rely on. In early 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant the new General-in-Chief. Together, they devised a plan to stop the Confederacy. They would launch coordinated offensives on all fronts, pounding the rebels from every direction. Unfortunately, the Union soldiers met stubborn resistance from the newly reorganized Confederate troops. Grant's losses were staggering. Nearly 54,000 Union soldiers were wounded or killed during the Wilderness Campaign. As the 1864 presidential elections loomed, Lincoln seemed destined for defeat. Once again, the cry of alarm regarding the war spread through the North. Even within the Republican Party, there was talk of replacing him. However, Lincoln was determined to remain in office. His re-election would show that the people approved of his emancipation policy. In June, he was nominated for a second term. Tennessee Senator Andrew Johnson, a Southerner and war Democrat, became his ideal choice for running mate. The opposition nominated General George B. McClellan, the very general that Lincoln had dismissed as commander of the Union armies. McClellan ran on a peace platform, promising to stop the fighting and restore both the Union and slavery. As the election approached, there was good news. General William Tecumseh Sherman had finally pushed his way into Atlanta and set out across Georgia, bringing ruin to everything in his path. Meanwhile, in Virginia, General Philip Sheridan was successfully battling rebels in the Shenandoah Valley, and General Grant was tightening his stranglehold on Richmond. By Election Day, it was clear that the Union would be victorious. The end of the war was finally in sight. Lincoln's policies had been vindicated, and even his critics rallied around him. He won re-election with 55% of the popular vote and an overwhelming Electoral College majority of 212 to 21. Lincoln recognized that the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure that might have no constitutional validity after the war was over. The legal framework for slavery would still exist in the former Confederate states, as well as in Union slave states that had been exempt from the proclamation. So, together with the Republican Party, he committed himself to a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. On April 8, 1864, by more than two-thirds majority, the Senate passed the 13th Amendment. A final vote came on January 31, 1865, when a cheering House of Representatives approved the 13th Amendment. Lincoln hailed the vote as a great moral victory. The states ratified the amendment, and it was added to the Constitution, becoming the law of the land. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln took his oath of office for the second time. The pressures of war clearly showed in his face. A friend noted that his features were haggard with care, tempest-tossed, and weather-beaten. He had endured more than any president, stoically withstanding public ridicule and criticism beyond the bounds of decency. He had suffered personal losses with the death of his son Tad and bouts of depression from which his sense of humor was able to rescue him. But through it all, he never faltered. His resolve to persevere was incorruptible and ultimately inspirational. His inaugural speech is considered to be among his greatest, a testimony to his humane spirit.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
A few weeks later, on April 9th, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The next day, news of the surrender turned Washington into a joyous madhouse. President Lincoln was already making plans for the hard task of Reconstruction. Blacks were now free, but they were not true citizens. Ending slavery was only the first step. What would the freed slaves do? How would the white Southerners and the freed slaves live together? 4 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln and his wife attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. Suddenly, a man dashed into their box and aimed a gun at the back of the president's head and shot him. An angry actor, an anti-abolitionist named John Wilkes Booth, had assassinated Lincoln at point-blank range. The moment of triumph was suddenly stung by the death of its greatest proponent. Gone was the man who one Civil War journalist described as exhibiting great calmness of temper, great firmness of purpose, supreme moral principle, and intense patriotism. After Lincoln's death, Secretary of War Stimson declared, "Now he belongs to the ages." From an ordinary beginning came an extraordinary man. To this day, Lincoln is considered to be the most effective person to ever hold the office of President of the United States. Lincoln's Civil War-era reforms established the moral obligation of the national government to ensure equal opportunity for all its people. Through the decades that followed, future presidents often sought to emulate this great man of carefully chosen words and wisdom.